Welcome back to the Kyle Olson Show. Last week, Rebecca Mansour wrote a fantastic piece titled Karen Bass's Long March from Communist Fringe to Biden's VP Shortlist at Breitbart News. I invite you to go to Breitbart.com and check it out. It was the headline on the site, got a ton of attention. So, Rebecca, what was the big takeaway from your investigation into Karen Bass?
Well, I think that, to me, it's that she's a dedicated Marxist-Leninist. At least she was at one time. And she hasn't really disavowed that until now that she's under intense scrutiny because of the vice presidential vetting process. I mean, she's finally come out and said, flat out in an interview with NBC News earlier this week, she said, and I quote, "I am not a socialist. I'm not a communist. I belong to one party my entire life, and that's the Democratic Party." Okay, now that's probably true in the sense that I don't believe she's been a member of any other political party, but that is not the full picture when you consider her decades-long association with communists, her membership in a communist front group controlled by Fidel Castro's communist regime, and her public praise of her communist mentor and her communist influencers as she was growing up. This all paints a much more complicated picture. And, this week I did a listicle at Breitbart.com listing these facts. I mean, just taking it one by one here, Kyle, the early communist influences. In an interview just in 2008, she spoke about how communists played, and I quote, "a huge role in shaping her when she was a student at Hamilton High School on the west side of Los Angeles." She said that a lot of the parents at the school were Communist Party members. She said, and I quote, "I grew up with a lot of red diaper babies." That's a slang term for children of Communist Party USA members during the Cold War. And she says that, and she mentions that many of her teachers were communists. And so they played a very influential role in her growing up. And then in 2017, she took to the floor of the US House to eulogize her, quote, "friend and mentor," O'Neill Cannon, who is a leading member of the Communist Party USA. In fact, in the obituary for Cannon, the communist website People's World cited his work as the Communist Party USA's education director in Southern California and as a member of the party's Southern California and National Central Committees. So there's that. And then there's also, I believe that you mentioned earlier in your show, Kyle, her membership, in fact, her leadership of a communist front group that was founded in 1969 by Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. And it was run by the Cuban intelligence service. And we know a lot about this. This is the Venceremos Brigade. Karen Bass was at the time listed as a leader of the Venceremos Brigade in Los Angeles. And in 1973, she made her first trip to Cuba when she was 19. And throughout the 1970s, she would make 8 trips to Cuba. Think about that. This was Cuba when it was, Americans were not allowed to go to Cuba at that time. This was during the height of the Vietnam War when Cuba was hosting Viet Cong combatants who were sending Americans home in body bags from Vietnam. This was a communist regime, and we know, like, as I said, that the Cuban intelligence service was running the Venceremos Brigade. We have testimony from former Cuban intelligence officials who defected to the United States who testified before the Senate. We also have testimony from undercover officers who tried to infiltrate the Venceremos Brigade, and they tell us what they faced. One of the things that we hear in this testimony is that, one, the intelligence officers of the Cuban regime were very careful in picking their leaders and the members of this because they saw them as assets to collect data, spy, espionage, and also for long-term influence. This is why they picked these people. And in fact, one of the undercover agents who tried to infiltrate the Venceremos Brigade in the 70s, he said, and I quote, "To be a member of the brigade, you had to be a confirmed Marxist-Leninist." And he said that essentially, even just being a member, you had to fill out a detailed application, you had to undergo interviews concerning your political beliefs, and you had to attend 3.5 months of twice-a-week indoctrination seminars. So, I mean, you had to be a dedicated person to be a member of the Venceremos Brigade. And to be a leader of the brigade, which Karen Bass was listed as in the Communist Daily newspaper, she was identified as a leader of the brigade. This was from 1975, this article about her. And she was also surveilled by the Los Angeles Police Department. They had an undercover division, and they were surveilling Karen Bass at that time because they saw her as a leader of the brigade, and said in one of their intelligence reports that she came back with, propaganda information. So she was a dedicated Marxist-Leninist, according to the documentation at the time. And that doesn't even get into all the other stuff, Kyle, because there was another clandestine Maoist organization that she was associated with as well. I mean, I could go, there's a whole lot there to delve into, my friend.
Yeah, I think there's a whole lot there, and I think there's a whole lot more that has not yet been uncovered. But what's so shocking to me is that there was a Politico story on Friday morning that said hundreds, I think it was 300 DNC members are calling on Karen Bass to be named the vice presidential nominee because she is a unifying candidate. She's a unifying prospect. And so for people to say, well, you're talking sort of fringe conspiracy theories and all of that sort of thing. Well, what I talked about in the last segment was that I think there is a strong case to be made that if Karen Bass is the vice presidential candidate or potentially vice president, she's a Cuban asset. I mean, that you look at what you found and what Tablet Magazine found, and historical documents from Venceramos Brigade, et cetera. I mean, she was a leader with a direct link to Cuba. What do you think that would mean for America if there was an individual like that as serving as vice president? Well,
Cuba got what they want. You're absolutely correct. I mean, part of the whole Venceramos Brigade's objective was long-term, planting the seeds for long-term political influence, hoping that these young people, these young radicals that they trained essentially, or that they indoctrinated, would eventually move into a position where they could be of help to the communist regime. And by help, I mean normalizing relations with Castro's Cuba. That's what Castro always wanted. Normalizing relations would help them alleviate all the pressures that are on them to remove that communist regime. And that's exactly what Karen Bass has been pushing for ages. And she finally got it. They finally got it. And that meant essentially that we were going to overlook all the horrors of that regime. So yeah, it's a terrible thing. And God only knows what else, putting a dedicated Marxist-Leninist in a position that's one heartbeat away from the Oval Office will mean for us. Because whoever Joe Biden is going to pick as his vice president is going to be very important, because that person could potentially become president. Let's just be honest. So yeah, it is definitely concerning, because I don't see that Karen Bass has really moved away from the positions that animated her when she was, a community organizer and activist in her youth. In fact, I see her trying to deflect from them. So I find this incredibly disturbing.
Rebecca Mansour, senior editor-at-large at Breitbart News. Really great piece. I look forward to continuing to talk with you about this if Karen Bass is the nominee, which I think the prospects of that are growing. But thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Kyle.